All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I see we've got some more people coming to the room right now, and I know that Senator King is going to join us here shortly. Excited today to be hosting this webinar, podcast, webcast with Mark Montgomery, the Executive Director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and Senator Angus King, one of the co-chairs, who will be on in just a few minutes. There's a little bit of background on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. It was established in the John McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019 to develop a consensus on the strategic approach to defending the United States in cyberspace against cyber attacks of significant consequence. The finished report was presented in the beginnings of our COVID pandemic on March 11, 2020. The Commission's report included over 80 recommendations focused on 6 pillars: reforming the government structure and organization, strengthening norms and non-military tools, promoting national resilience, reshaping the cyber ecosystem, operationalizing cybersecurity collaboration with the private sector, and preserving and employing the military instrument of national power. In addition to the report that came out in March, the Commission recently released its new white paper on cybersecurity lessons coming out of the pandemic. The white paper itself highlights another 30 recommendations from the final report, as well as 5 new recommendations. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce Mark Montgomery, who's with us, and I'll introduce Senator King when he joins us. So Mark serves as the Executive Director for the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. He most recently served as Policy Director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under the leadership of Senator John McCain. That position, he coordinated policy efforts on national defense strategy, capabilities and requirements, defense policy, and cyber issues. And of course, prior to that, Mark served for over 3 decades in the U.S. Navy as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, retiring as a Rear Admiral in 2017. His flag officer assignments were around the globe, including Director of Operations at U.S. PACOM, Commander Carrier Strike Group 5, embarked aboard the USS George Washington stationed in Japan, and the Deputy Director for Plans, Policy, and Strategy J5 at U.S. UCOM. He's also selected as a White House Fellow and assigned to the National Security Council, where he served as Director of Transnational Threats from 1998 to 2000. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with a bachelor's and master's degree in history. He subsequently also obtained a master's degree in history from Oxford and completed the U.S. Navy's nuclear power training program. So, Mark, we're super thrilled to have you here. And let me just go ahead and mention Senator Angus King, who'll be with us. I understand that Senator King is traveling across our great nation and will join us here shortly. Senator King was sworn in as Maine's first independent U.S. Senator in 2013, holding the same seat once held by Story Maine leaders like Edmund Muskie, George Missel, and Olympia Snowe. He's now in his 2nd term. He's a member of the Armed Services Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, as well as the Committee on Rules Administration. In his time in the Senate, Senator King has worked to strengthen America's national security, conducted critical oversight of the intelligence community, and supported common sense budget priorities that promotes prosperity. Of course, Senator King is known as a bipartisan consensus builder, and most importantly, for the purpose of this conversation, he served as a co-chair of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So Mark, we're going to jump right in, and I want to mention, by the way, for the audience, there will be time for questions at the end of this session. We're going to do a first session with Mark and with Senator King, if he's able to join us. Then we'll turn to a group of some of the key players behind the Commission's report, some of the key advisors and staffers to the Commission. So we'll talk to them in just a second. Then they'll take questions from the audience. So Mark, let's just start right at the top, right? The Solarium Commission had a big mandate, and you guys put out 80 recommendations. A lot of those, Mark, are legislative recommendations. And we know the NDA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is working its way. It's partly done in the Senate. The House has issued its report, and they're considering amendments now. What recommendations from the report have made it into the Senate and House versions, and what do we think will come out in conference committee? What's your sense how this is going to play out of all those legislative recommendations that you all made?
So you're right. We are in the middle of the process now. In the Senate, we've done the base bill and the markup, and 1 week of the floor amendments. They'll come back off recess, do another week or so, then the bill will be completed. In the House, we've done the base bill and the markup. They're beginning floor amendments in about a week. Right. So my take is that in each one of them, there's 18 to 20 of our recommendations already. And I expect a few more in the Senate and a number more in the House, depending how the House handles floor amendments. There have been years when there's almost no floor amendments. Historically, right. There's a number in managers' packages to bring them in. So I expect, each one of them to have between 22 and 25 recommendations. They won't be the same ones, right? There'll be a total of about 28 recommendations probably in play. Clearly, for the 18 to 20 that are in both bills and look pretty similar, well, they're going to have a great opportunity of getting through. And that would include almost all our defense ones, the ones that are defense plus another another provision, another agency in the provision, say DHS or Commerce, and then there'll be a group that are have almost no defense in it. Those were the hard ones, right? You got to convince people to put them into the NDAA, and those are the ones we're working hardest on right now. I'll also tell you that continuity of the economy got into the Senate bill, and I'm hoping to get in the House bill. To me, that's one of the two key federal government reform initiatives. Getting it so that the government is doing its continuity of the economy planning. The second one's National Cyber Director. As you know personally, there's a hearing in the House next week on it. We'll eventually do our Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, and I think it'll discuss that a lot in a couple of weeks from now with the two chairmen of the commission. And so I think that'll have its day in court to see if it can get in the bill as well. But we have a broad brush. There's cyber workforce ones in. There's strengthening CISA ones in. Several of those, I think 3 different ones that strengthen CISA in different ways. And they're ones on how to improve the interconnectivity of federal cyber centers within the House bill. Right now, we're trying to get that in the Senate. So what I'd say is overall, there'll be a strong defense element to the provisions, and then there'll be a healthy number of non-defense provisions in there, which is exactly how the two chairmen, Representative Gallagher and Senator King, who's joined us now, envisioned this when they did it. We are, to steal Representative Gallagher's line, biased towards action, to get things done. So I'll pass it back.
That's great. I mean, I think it really is amazing that you all had this many recommendations, this many solid, really substantive recommendations, and you're able to get so many of them really moving very quickly. And I think it's a tribute to the way the commission was organized with 2 bipartisan co-chairs from both the House and the Senate. And of course, we've just been joined by one of those co-chairs, Senator Angus King. Senator King, thank you for being here with us. We've talked about your bio and your background and the amazing job that you've done as a bipartisan consensus builder on Capitol Hill, I guess a tripartisan consensus builder on Capitol Hill. Senator King, could you talk to us? Can you hear us, by the way, sir? Looks like we've got a bit of a challenge with your connection there. It sounds like you're coming in and out, sir.
I can hear you fine.
Well, we could actually sort of make you out a little bit, but it's coming in and out. I think we may have a weak signal there. So we might just want to try you back here in a few seconds and see if the signal solidifies. Either that or some of our nation state competitors have decided to block our bandwidth a little bit. I doubt that's what's going on. But Senator King, we'll keep an eye on your connection, see if we can't bring you back in with better audio. Sir, can you hear us now? Okay. If not, Mark, let's stick with you. And when Senator King gets back, we'll have him just jump in. Some of the recommendations that the commission made, Mark, were not all legislative, right? Some of them, some of the legislative ones in particular, not all of them are going to be an NDA. What do you see as the path for non-NDA stuff, like the stuff on labeling, stuff on liability? Do you expect that to happen in this Congress, or are we going to wait until after the election, do you think? And it sounds like we got Senator King back. Senator King, are you there?
I'm back.
Oh.
I am here. And Jamal, thank you. I'm sorry. I'm traveling in rural Mississippi, so if you lose me, I'm on a trip with one of my sons. Listen, I heard most of your comments, and like you, I'm very pleased with the momentum that we already have. I think we have something like 18 amendments already in the defense bill, and we're working on several more. And we've had great cooperation. I think the secret is that this is an absolutely nonpartisan issue. In 30 meetings of our commission, I never heard anybody say anything that had anything to do with political party. In fact, I don't even know the political parties of the other members of the commission other than the members of Congress. So the biggest challenge is convincing our colleagues of the seriousness of the threat. But I think, ironically, in some ways, the pandemic has people's awareness kind of attack. So, yeah, we're making great progress. Mark and the staff have done an exceptional job of getting us to this point. One thing we did, Jamal, that I think really made a difference was instead of just saying, here's a recommendation for continuity of the economy. Go do it. We actually drafted the legislative language. So we handed the committees finished legislation that was a lot easier for our colleagues on all the various committees. Idea, we say, okay, here it is. That's been the progress thus far, but we still have a ways to go.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, sir. And I think it's great that you all were able to not just, like most commissions do, sort of come up with a bunch of lists of things Congress ought to do without giving them the tools to do it. And so I think it's great. I think it's great that you all should mention the fact that you had this broad group of folks that weren't just legislators. You had experts from the outside: Tom Fanning, Sam Ravitch, Frank Salufo, Chris Inglis. I mean, real people who know this area well. And as you say, it didn't matter about party; it was about getting to the right direction for the nation. So it's really amazing that y'all have done this. I was asking Mark earlier, sir, before you hopped on, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. What do you see as the path? One, for the legislative recommendations that won't be an NDA, things like liability and labeling, as well as what do you expect the path for the executive branch recommendations? Do you see those being implemented? And if so, do we expect them now or maybe after the next election? What's the time frame on that, sir? I think we might have lost the senator there. Appreciate you traveling. Mark, you want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in on that one. So on the 30 or so that were executive branch or executive branch and private sector, we're going to do a report card. It's one of the requirements that if we go forward, one of the provisions is for us to be extended for into the next NDA cycle, but with a primary requirement of producing a report card on how things are performed. And I would say on the executive branch, things are already happening. Frankly, some of the ideas we put in the report are things that we knew the executive branch was thinking about or considering, or we spurred it with some action and the idea of we'll do it before you do legislative action. So I think the things going along, and I think particularly Chris Krebs and at CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, has really stepped out on a lot of issues, but also at the FBI and the NCI JTF and in other areas, they've been aggressive working this. And even at NIST, you see some of the changes. So we'll come with a report card that grades both our performance in getting legislative proposals done, but also how the executive branch does in doing these. And we'll probably do 2 or 3 report cards over the next, if we do continue along over the next 16 months to kind of track that along. And that's the whole idea, is to kind of show the arc of achievement on this. What I will say is historically, commissions get about, that are non-crisis commissions get about 13 to 15% of their recommendations handled. I think we'll be well past that early on, but that's because we have 4 legislators, and Senator King alluded to that at the beginning of his initial comments. Having legislators biases you towards action, and it gives you the vehicle to do it. I can't tell you enough, 2 or 3 of our proposals only got done because at past 10 p.m., Senator King was calling another senator to remove a hold or to clear up an issue, a misunderstanding. And that's just not something you can do, even with a august chair of a commission who's not a congressman. First of all, he doesn't have the right cell phone number, but second, he doesn't have the authorization to make that phone call. The same thing's happening in the House. Having Representative Jim Langevin as as the NDA subcommittee chair has an extreme palliative effect on the ability of our provisions to get through. But also, we've benefited from his dual role. He's also on the Homeland Security Cyber Subcommittee. And in fact, we'll be holding a hearing with them next Friday, with Representative Richmond's committee next Friday, largely due to Representative Langevin and his team and the staff of the Homeland Security pushing hard for that.
Right. No, it's great. Senator King, one of the things that we've talked about in this space, and I know we only have a few minutes left before we turn to the staff and advisor panel. We have to hear about sort of non-traditional national security emergencies like pandemic infections. Is a cyber environment the next place for that non-traditional national security emergency? And if so, what can we do in the immediate term to address it? And if not, what is that next big, non-traditional national security threat? I think we might have lost Senator again. Mark, thoughts on that one?
Sure. So, and he said this previously, Senator King, that we were trying to be the 9/11 commission for cyber without 9/11, right? The idea is to get ahead of ourselves on this. But look, the pandemic then caught up with us and said very clearly, here is, the first really significant non-traditional national security effect to hit our country that, Katrina, I think, didn't quite meet that element in terms of the national security. Certainly it was economic security and personal security, but the pandemic really is this national security event.
Right.
And it exposed that over 4 administrations, we have not been kind of done the diligent, pre-planning, preparation for incident response, and development of long-term recovery options. And I think, there's a debate about how the recovery is going, but I'll tell you, the initial pre-planning just probably wasn't there at the level we'd want. And we know, I'll just say for cyber, we know it's not there now.
Yeah.
And it needs to be there. So what we're trying to do in becoming and building a strategic leader, what our pandemic response annex said was, look, it demonstrated about 30 of our recommendations that were kind of that were organized around the precept of having a properly organized government and an effective public-private collaboration.
Yeah.
These were validated. And, the key one being the strategic leadership that we think a national cyber director provides, but a secondary one being the pre-planning that a joint cyber planning office and a continuity of the economy planning effort will give. If you build those building blocks, you will inherently, the plan, it's not, as they say in the military, it's not the plan, it's the planning effort. That planning effort will really pay dividends. So I think the pandemic validated that for us. And yes, we do think a cyber, I don't know if the next event's another pandemic or a cyber, but we should not be surprised when a significant cyber event happens.
Yeah. So Mark, in the last 2 minutes we've got here before we turn to the staff and advisor panel, tell me this. You've emphasized, I think, 2 really big picture, really important issues. One is this idea of core strategic leadership, but the idea that you need a person in the White House, Senate confirmed, who's got a team that can really execute on this mission. Tell us why that's so important, number one. And then second, tell us about why this issue of public-private collaboration, cooperation, and sort of doing it jointly at all times, and being prepared ahead of time for both these things. Why do you need that strategic leadership, and why do you need that collaboration in this environment in the last minute or minute and a half that we've? I think you got to meet there.
I'll take the public-private collaboration. If Senator King's available, I'll have him talk about the National Cyber Director. So on the public-private collaboration, what I'd say is, look, this is the first time where we're trying to defend. Cyber is affecting and placing at risk our national critical infrastructure in a way that no kinetic threat has in 70 years. We haven't had to defend ourselves because of 4,000 miles of the Atlantic and 7,000 miles of the Pacific, and our kind of massive retaliation plan for nuclear. We didn't have to defend this. Now we have to defend that. And it's in this view that 87% of the national critical infrastructure that we have to defend isn't owned and operated by the government. It's not .gov, .mil, or .ic. Therefore, you have to build this public-private collaboration so that you can introduce both benefits and burdens to the companies that own it. So they raise their game. Let's be clear: the game is high in financial services because they've been under criminal assault for 2 or 3 decades. The game is pretty high in energy because they've seen some nefarious activity by nation states, but also because they're regulated to a different degree. The game is not high in a large swath of the rest of our national critical infrastructure. And we need to build that collaboration and bring that game up so that our water industry, our pipelines, our core transport industries are all ready to go. I'd like to ask Senator King if he wants to talk about the value of the National Cyber Director before we get offline here.
Yeah, no, Senator, see you're with us there.
Yeah, I really apologize. We're in a no-fly zone, I guess, and I apologize for dropping in and out. I know how annoying that is. Yeah, I think the National Cyber Director is one of our most important proposals, and as you probably have already discussed, Jamil, the White House is crazy about the idea, and we're trying to persuade them. I mean, the FBI, it's in NSA, National Security Council, Department of Defense. I mean, it's and that's the problem. I mean, that's a real problem in a time of emergency. We learned that with the pandemic, and so we're trying to persuade. I believe that the National Cyber Director is a favor to the White House. It gives them 1 point of authority, 1 point of responsibility. When I'm contracting with somebody, I want one throat to choke, and really that's what we're talking about with the National Cyber Director. If you have scattered, siloed responsibilities and authorities, you're going to have scattered silos. So I think this is one of our most important recommendations. We're working with Mike Rounds, who's the chair of the Cyber Subcommittee of Armed Services, trying to respond to some questions that he's had. And we're going to continue working with the White House, because I think this is this is not an unreasonable proposal, and I think it will strengthen the
No, sir, I think that makes a lot of sense, and thank you for the comments. I think
dealing with this health crisis.
Right. No, look, I mean, your point about single throat to choke and the diversity of agencies and departments that are playing in the space, absolutely right on. And the question, I think, as you point out, is a debate between the White House over control over this position and the like. And so it'll be an interesting debate, and certainly a critically important one, as both you and Mark highlighted. The strategic importance of having strategic long-term leadership in this space is critical, particularly at a time when we may not be as prepared as we ought to be for a very pressing threat. So, sir, thank you for being on. Thanks for taking the time out of your trip across the country. Please be safe out there.
Yes,
Mark, thank you for being here. Thank you for your leadership on the commission. We're now going to turn to the rest of the panel, and I'll go ahead and ask and mention the panelists themselves. So we'll bring them in. We're going to have Tatiana Bolton, the policy director for the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. John Costello, just previously, and John, you can tell us about your new position, but previously the senior director and Task Force 2 lead for the commission. Ali King, strategic communications and congressional advisor for the commission. And finally, Brandon Valeriano, a senior advisor to the commission. So a distinguished group of advisors and leaders who've had a long experience in the cyberspace arena, and many of whom are going on to continue to lead either with the commission or in other roles in government like you, John, going forward. So looks like we got all of you in, which is terrific. And thank you all and thank you to the audience for bearing with us through the audio challenges. So look, I want to start right at the top, and Tatiana, talk to us about how the commission came together and what the early days were like. How did this thing get rolling?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having us on. It was quite interesting, I'll say, at the beginning. We had a lot of work to get done in a short amount of time. We had a year to get a final report published. And at the beginning, we were working on a shoestring staff and budget. We had, I think, one person, a detailee from the DoD, and myself and John and Mark kind of helping out from because he wasn't officially hired yet. And we were trying to pull together a staff, pull together detailees from the agencies, which Mark diligently worked on for months, I'd say. Pull together contracts and budget and all of that while trying to create a strategy that we could, and a work plan to create this report that we managed to publish within a year. And I think it's a testament to the type of people and the high caliber of staff that we have, that we were able to do that in such a short amount of time. I know that Mark is very proud of the fact that we came in on time and under budget. So I think it's a testament to the people that we had working on this commission.
Well, and a testament to your leadership. I know you served in the Department of Homeland Security, and you were a contract specialist for the Navy, and of course, you're a graduate of the Ohio State University in Georgetown. So, so it's awesome. So, Ali, talk to us about you got 80 recommendations. That's a lot, right? There's sub recommendations, right? What are the sort of the big five? I know we heard the senator and Mark talk about National Cyber Director. What are the other ones? We've heard about continuity economy. There's a lot of other stuff going on. Talk to us about what the top five are, including. You're muted, Ali.
Sorry about that. Yep. So obviously, National Cyber Director and continuity of the economy really are in the forefront. And I won't go into too much detail about that because both Mark and Senator King provided you with the insight and the direction of why those are essential. But for me, I think, and I'm going to show my hand here because I am a Navy civilian, I think participation in threat intel sharing programs and threat hunting on the dev networks is very, very important. And we need to have a shared picture of the threat environment so we can proactively address the cyber vulnerabilities within that key sector. And this should be a contractual requirement. It should be in the DFARS if it isn't already there. So it's not a nice you can participate. It's like, no, this is a requirement to do business with the DoD moving forward. I also think too, from a strategic communications perspective, something that sounds a little bit scarier than it is the admin subpoena authority for CISA. So everybody's like, ooh, admin subpoena authority. Oh my God, what is that? That sounds serious. Well, essentially what it is, and Tatiana can correct me on this if I'm not representing it, is that it gives CISA the authority so that they can provide critical infrastructure owners and operators with threat data before an attack. Because currently, I don't think they're in a position where they can legally do that. And so that will help everybody else collaborate in a more effective manner for the idea of collective defense. It's not just like, hey, that's your problem, sorry it happened to you. So that can foster the important conversations moving ahead. I also think, and I think you would appreciate this, is the next recommendation, I think, is developing a cloud security certification. So with everybody scattered to the four winds working from home now, I think now's the time for us to be able to have that conversation. I think working with NIST, OMB, and DHS, or the right folks within the federal government to start getting the ball rolling there. And so those are like my major ones. Now, what I will say is that with National Cyber Director, you hear over and over again the talking points of we need strategic leadership in the White House. And I don't think few people would disagree, although it could potentially eat away at OMB's authority, but we need a different model moving forward. But what will need to happen is not only will the president need to nominate someone, there will be responsibility of the Congress to actually, move quickly into getting these people in their positions in power instead of just held up for political reasons. And so I think that part of that needs to be discussed as well, not just, hey, the president, we're going to do you a favor. It's like, Congress, no, you need to follow through on this as well. Like you have a role in this, the balance of power. And the continuity of the economy piece, I think it's essential. I don't know how we can do this moving ahead. And it's interesting because folks will often focus on the size of the defense budget and all the things that we spend money on. But we do that because we have to protect the economy. That's what makes America a superpower. It's not necessarily our military. It's that we have to protect these centers of economic prosperity and growth. And so we need to move out quickly on those, I think.
Right. And of course, about this, the intersection between these things. You served in the office of Congressman Mike Gallagher as a DoD fellow, consultant for Deloitte, Booz Allen Hamilton, MBA from Georgetown, and a BS and a BA from George Mason, where I teach. So, go Patriots. So thanks for that, Allie. John, I want to talk a little bit, and I know you're limited what you can say given your new position. So tell us a little about your new position, and if you can, if you're able to. But I do want to talk about this idea of continuity economy, which Allie touched on, and the senator and Mark both touched on. What is that concept? What's it about? What are we talking about when we say continuity economy? And to the extent you can't get too detailed into it, we'll ask Tatiana to follow up. But talk to us about what you can say about that.
Certainly. So what I can talk about. Where the concepts came from. And I really got to credit Commissioner Ravitch, Samantha Ravitch, for really, I'd say, establishing the conceptual underpinnings and making a really strong argument for this. Now, as many people know, and you certainly know, Jamil, is the United States has very robust processes and invests a great deal of money every year for continuity of operations, continuity of the presidency, continuity of government. Right. I mean, that is a cornerstone, and it comes from the Cold War. How do we make sure in a nuclear scenario or major disaster, how do we ensure that the president's protected, his cabinet protected, and the entire federal government, Congress, executive branch, judicial branch, can continue to function even under much reduced conditions? Now, we have that, and that makes a lot of sense. But, coming into the 21st century where so much of our national security and power comes from our economic strength, what is our plan, and what do we have in place to make sure that we can continue a strong, vibrant, functioning economy and ensure confidence in that economy if there is a massive attack or massive disruption, of which cyber is increasingly becoming likely. Now, when we crafted this recommendation, we knew that it was a little bit It's not tangential to the remit, but we knew that cyber is just one incident, and increasingly likely one that could sort of spark and prompt this.
Right.
So in looking at this, the things that we asked were, and we didn't have all the answers. The commission's not in a place to say what specific industries, companies, et cetera, are absolutely vital to the economy, but we knew enough to say what are the contours of the process and what does this need to get to. So we said, direct the government to prepare a study and a plan that can identify critical elements of the national economy, specifically ones that are responsible for distribution mechanisms at a national level, whether that's finance, financial markets, capital markets, oil and natural gas, large-scale transfer of bulk cargo, rail, and shipping. And look for way and develop a plan to make sure that working with industry, how those can continue in a crisis. And obviously that requires understanding the types of crises that could be hit. Now, I'd really like to emphasize that that second to last point, which is, the U.S. government is not in a position to know the entire logistics networks of the economy, nor do they know the supply chain constraints of the economy. So this has to be, by its very nature, has to be something that is done in coordination with the private sector. As we saw with COVID, First thing the government did was say we need to get private sector companies on board and see what the art of the possible is. So those are the contours, I believe. The few other things I think is looking at areas where we know we need resilience. So one thing is looking in the finance sector, asking the government to identify specific areas where we need to have data in a protected and verified format in case we have to reconstitute. Now, the most obvious example there is finance sector, where you have financial records and you want to make sure that they're the same. If it gets destroyed or altered, you want to make sure the same ones they had before. The other place is looking at areas of the economy where we might need to, I don't want to say devolve, but have a little bit more of analog redundancy. So looking at power transmission, so that we have a backup that's not dependent upon the internet, and it can still function in case there's a denial of internet connectivity. So that's another example. Those are I think the two things, specific things we ask the government to consider and identify without prescribing any sort of mechanism or action to be taken.
Yeah, and of course, we've seen interesting moves on that already. With the financial services, the FSARC has done a lot of work to create resilience there, and the power industry has been thinking about these challenges and how to address the IT/OT issues for a while. And Brandon, we're going to get to you in just a second, because I've got some questions for you about this idea of collective defense. But Tatiana, anything else we want to talk about in this continuity of the economy concept? Particularly, I think what's really interesting about this is you guys released this report on March 11th. Just after COVID had sort of really started taking hold. So you all didn't have that sort of preparation to understand the huge impact that was going to have on our economy. You all seem to have gotten ahead of that and really realized that this economic, problem was a serious issue that we needed to grapple with. How have you seen this thing play out in the COVID environment? I know you guys released a report about the post-COVID environment. What role does continuity of the economy play, and how can we look at what we've learned from this experience to translate into future success in a potential cyber incident going forward?
Yeah, I mean, so I can't say we were prescient or anything. I think there's a lot of people who were looking at this issue, saw it as a problem. And for example, our Commissioner Samantha Ravitch was a huge proponent of doing COAT. And when you have the pandemic hit, I think what it showed to us is that a lot of what we're saying really played out in the news. And what's happening is that thankfully, a lot of people who can make the changes and the decisions to implement some of the recommendations that we find are very critical, like the resilience planning, exercises, and COAT, are now seeing the urgency. And I think the pandemic kind of is like a call to action, and we want the commission report, as well as all of the efforts of the commissioners and the congressional commissioner members, to actually have this moment be the moment where we finally make some of the changes that we've needed in cybersecurity for a long time.
No, that's great. And by the way, for the audience, we will turn to your questions here in just about 5-6 minutes. So please do put your questions. I see there's a few already in there in the Q&A box, but go ahead and put more in there. There's a space down at the bottom or to the right of your screen where you can do that. Brandon, I want to talk about one of the key parts of the report that I thought was really interesting, and that the senator and Mark both alluded to, with this idea about public-private collaboration. One of the things you guys talked about is the need for a sort of a fundamental shift in our nation, and to move to the idea of thinking about cyber as an area for collective defense. The idea that industry and the government have to work tightly together, not just share information, which we've talked about for a long time, and there's more to be done on that, of course, but really to collaborate in real time, constantly, to defend the nation together, and not as sort of separate entities today. Today, we expect every single company to defend themselves, and it's unsustainable. How do you all think about that problem? What are some of the recommendations you had in the report to address this collective defense idea? Sounds really interesting to me. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, that's a key aspect of the report, because the reality is deterrence as we construct it is inadequate. We needed to do more. Deterrence in reality is more than just establishing costs and attacks. It's also about enabling the defense in the first place. And the reality is, in cyberspace, the defense is just as much the private sector as it is the public sector. In fact, it's probably more about the private sector. So to enable a real collective defense, to enable what we ended up calling layered cyber deterrence, you needed to have an intense public-private partnership. And one of the big criticisms we've levied so far is that we did not have a whole nation approach. We only had a whole department approach in some ways, a strategy developed by Cyber Command and Department of Defense. We needed to go further than that. So in order to do that, we've enabled a lot of the recommendations, and we pushed forward a lot of recommendations suggested by Task Force 2 on top of Task Force 1, which was primarily focused on military levers.
And what are talk about some of those recommendations? I know there's a recommendation on sort of a joint planning cell that Mark referenced, right? There's also this idea of a joint collaborative environment. Tell us what that's about. What are we trying to get at with all these sort of, there may be a broader center. Talk to us about those recommendations and why those are so important to this collective defense.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Tatiana can help me up with that, or John, because that wasn't really task force.
Sure. I mean, I'll just say that the joint collaborative environment and all those other recommendations, they're based on the premise that we have stovepipes right now. You can see that this is a thread that runs through our report, from the National Cyber Director to the joint collaborative environment to the strategy that Brandon just mentioned. We just see that there's that the United States needs a coherent strategic approach to cybersecurity, and all of these recommendations that we have in terms of the joint collaborative environment, they work to enable the strategic thinking that needs to happen across the government. And John, if you want to jump in.
John, thoughts?
Yeah, Jamil, that's a good question. I got to say, the joint collaborative environment and the Joint Cyber Planning Cell. What we did is we tried to take a look at each of the dimensions of collaboration. And I mean, and we came from the premise of what is the purpose of collaboration? The purpose of collaboration is action. It needs to be biased towards action, to borrow a phrase from Congressman Gallagher. So we looked at what are the things that are preventing, because information sharing it isn't there for its own sake. It needs to be leaning towards something. So we asked ourselves, what are the things that may be hurdles or obstructing us taking action or biasing ourselves towards action? And we came up with a few different things. Legally speaking, we looked for legal barriers, and we found that even with CISA 2015, that removed a lot of barriers that prevented the private sector from sharing with the government. And we said, we're not going to touch that. So we looked at, technically, how do we technically share data? How do we do that at scale? And we found that there are some problems. So the joint collaborative environment is intended to provide a platform by which, within the government and between the government and private entities, it can facilitate faster sharing of information. Now, what you see baked in there is a council that can help establish structures, establish fields that can try to generate a consensus and agreement on how best to do that. The Joint Cyber Planning Cell is another sort of hurdle to collaboration. We can't wait until an incident happens or after an incident to say, okay, what are we going to do about it? There needs to be an investment in planning resources with the private sector and the federal government. But the private sector, planning for a cyber incident is not a revenue producing activity. So I think from the commission's perspective, they wanted the government to do a stronger investment to help the private sector do that and facilitate that, because they obviously are a major and key component. So it was trying to tackle a few different dimensions to try to achieve the same end.
And do you see JCE or the Joint Planning Cell or the center? Do we see any of those getting into NDA, or do we think that's going to come later as part of a larger separate package?
I defer to Mark on that. Mark?
Mark's not on, so Mark's back out in the audience. Allie, do you have thoughts on that? Do you know if there's a plan on that right now?
So I have to yield to Mark. I'm not allowed to show too much
light. All right. Well, let me ask you this. What do we expect from the commission in the future? I know we got about 3 minutes left before we go to audience questions. What's coming next? Do we see more white papers? I know there's been some talk about other things, maybe something on NCD. Talk about what can you tell us about what's coming next?
Yeah, sure. So we are going to we're planning right now to release 3 additional white papers. So if you had an opportunity to look at the pandemic white paper that came out a couple of weeks ago, there will be several others that will be released in August before we have to button up from a statutory requirements perspective. Hopefully the new NDA will get signed and we'll have that 16-month extension with a smaller team that can then go in and validate how successful we were and what were some items that also need to be further studied to include encryption, which I know a lot of folks are interested in.
Well, so on that note, I mean, I'm interested to know about encryption, because obviously this is a hotly discussed topic, right? The commission didn't really come to a decision on encryption. It was, they laid out a lot of the issues at play. Who wants to take a question on encryption? I think John might be constrained. Tatiana, can you give us a little bit of insight into encryption? Yeah.
So as you said, it's a hotly contested topic, and there were differing opinions amongst the staff and amongst the commissioners on where, how to recommend, or what to say, what to recommend in our report. And so we had a thorough debate about it in one of our 30 commission meetings. Unfortunately, it was the debate happened towards the end when we were finalizing our recommendations. And I think generally there were people who were, pro stronger encryption, and people who were, or agencies that were pro, they were on the other side and so what we ended up doing is basically saying both sides have, they're coming from the right place. Both sides are trying to improve, United States security. We're not, we didn't want to we weren't saying either side is right or wrong, because we also didn't have the time to really delve into this issue. And so we basically settled on noting that we couldn't talk about or answer the question thoroughly, and we and so it's one of the topics that unfortunately we just couldn't settle on.
Let me add real quick. The big consideration for many was repression, right? That we need to ensure rights, and we also need to enable international protests and demonstrations of rights against foreign repressive governments, and encryption technology enables that. So we have a dual role of trying to ensure that law enforcement has access to devices when they need to. But on the other hand, we're an American nation that's supposed to establish liberties and freedoms. And how do you do that if you deny that access route through disabling encryption? So that was the fundamental tension, really. And that's why we can't really go forward with a recommendation that just suggests we open it all up or we close anything all up, because there are a lot of different concerns here, especially internationally.
Terrific. Yeah, important points. Well, let me go to the audience for questions. We've got about 8 questions in the box. I see one more coming in now, 9. So let's just take a question from the audience. So we got about 14 minutes left. The first question, I'll open up to anybody from the panel who wants to answer. Phil Reitinger, who runs the Global Cybersecurity Alliance, asked about the National Cyber Director position. He says he wants to understand what model it'd be based on and what relationship it would have with the Assistant Director. He doesn't dispute the need for a cyber lead at the NSC. But this seems sort of different and seems to bear the risk of potential bureaucratic struggles and disunity of command. Tell us about that. Who wants to take that one? Nobody.
well, I can,
Tatiana,
I can,
hop
I,
in. Yeah,
I can
please.
take that. I'm working on the, on this topic.
Right.
Phil Reidinger, by the way, was one of our red team members, and we thank him for all of the help that he gave to us on the commission. He was one of the experts that we consulted. So on the NCD, the second, I'm sorry, I forgot your first question, but the second question on coordination with CISA. Basically, what we're trying to do with the NCD is empower, is to have a strategic leadership at the top, which would give a vision and not micromanage specific agencies, but would enable CISA to focus on its own expertise, the National Risk Management Center and the CISA Central now, right? Responding to threats as they happen and helping with coordination. And so the relationship would be one of strategic leadership to action and implementation of a vision. And so I think that's sort of the idea behind the NCD.
Yeah. And the model, I think, was one of the other questions.
Model, right. So thank
USTR,
you. So
right? Yeah.
we looked at several different White House offices that exist. Some Senate confirmed, some not. The U.S. Trade Representative, the Office of ONDCP, and we took sort of things from some of those offices to craft what we believe is the most advantageous or best recommendation. Senate confirmed position within the White House complex of approximately 75 to 100 people. Leading the strategic vision for the nation.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that. So Shazeb Javani, one of our NSI's technology fellows, asked about the risks associated with public-private partnerships. Is there a concern that some of these private organizations might be multinationals that don't have the same incentives as the commission or the cybersecurity director, or frankly, the U.S. government writ large? Is there a concern that when you're talking about doing these really tight collaborations, that you're dealing with people who have fundamentally different motivations, different interests, particularly when it comes to stuff that happens over?
Well, yeah,
or Brandon?
Well, that's a challenge that everyone has to deal with multinational corporations. But our focus is mainly on enabling U.S. companies that are able to be plugged into the system. And there has to be a willingness for that to happen in the first place. And we've seen that done quite well in the financial industry, but not in other industries. So we need to start to build an infrastructure. Expanding out and starting to think about security concerns within the infrastructure is probably step 2, but we haven't even developed step 1 so far.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Ali, Tatiana, thoughts? No?
Yeah, sure. So there's always risk and reward that comes into play. So you have to figure out, is the juice worth the squeeze, and what are your commonalities? What are your equities? And really focus there and be able to create an agreement and an understanding that this is the scope of what we're going to focus on. And if you do it that way, I think it's the right approach to ensure that everybody has skin in the game and that you're working collectively towards something. And it'll be shown pretty obviously early if these aren't the right partners or if this isn't the right endeavor. So, but you have to get started.
Makes sense. Mark Erste from Congressman Chabot's office asked about the question of cyber defense and hardening, right? He wants to talk actually about offense and cost imposition, right? How do we achieve this goal of deterrence that you all have talked about? I know, Brandon, you all have worked on this quite extensively. What are the commission's recommendations when it comes to how we impose costs across the interagency beyond just the sort of defend forward mission that we've now seen Cyber Command take on at DoD?
Yeah, I did write a lawfare on this, and I think in the past we haven't been very clear about how we're going to impose costs. And that is certainly an aspect of defend forward, and we want a little bit more clarity in terms of declaratory policy on what we're going to defend and what our thresholds are. And one of the other white papers we're working on for the end of this commission is about signaling, which has been entirely left out of cybersecurity strategies. Because if you want to communicate a coercive desire, you need to tell the adversary what that coercive desire is and how they're supposed to interpret actions. So we need clarity on that process. But the other thing we've lacked so far is a whole of nation entanglement strategy. And that's something Joe and I talked about a few years ago in international security. But the goal is to bring in all levers of national power and to start to leverage the DOJ and the Department of State to establish costs on top of the Department of Defense. because there are other ways to establish costs. And in international relations literature, we've known for a long time that it's not all about punishment. And more often than not, you're able to get other countries to do things you want them to do through positive inducement and positive reinforcement. So international regulations, international standards, institutions, all that has been left out of the State Department, especially after we removed that office in 2017.
Makes sense. Alex Casandino, recent graduate of UC Berkeley, asks, you know, on these public-private partnerships, right? Do we see that tech companies today are more willing post-COVID to pursue collaboration given the costs and the rising number of cyber attacks, or is there still significant resistance to that public-private collaboration? And in particular, this is a good broad question for a broader audience. What are the threats that companies should be most worried about in this current environment? Let's take that one.
I'll jump on real quick. I mean, one thing we need to establish more is liability protections for data sharing. And that's something we haven't been able to get in the NDA just yet, but we're still hopeful. There's still time. But that's something that needs to move forward because companies need a little bit of protection if they're going to demonstrate and share data. At some point, we need to move towards a FAA kind of system of reporting all breaches and vulnerabilities, but we're just not there yet. What was the other part of the question?
So I think the question was, what else can we? What are the threats should industry be concerned about in the current environment? What are the big things that they're facing out there today?
The big thing we've left out, of course, is water, right? And that led to an escalation right now between Iran and Israel recently, when theoretically or supposedly Iran attacked an Israeli water plant. And our water plants are entirely unprotected at this point. There's a lot of critical infrastructure that we haven't started to protect because we just don't think them as vulnerability points, when in reality, the things we don't protect at all are the prime vulnerability points. So it's things like that I'm worried about.
Makes sense. Tatiana, any additional thoughts on that, on those couple issues?
No, I think Brandon got it.
Great, thanks so much. Jerry Adams asks about, with respect to taking action in the cyber arena, whether it's preventative, preemptive, covert, or overt, who's responsible in the government for risk assessment and the analysis of alternatives? Is it purely a DoD function? Is it if it's the intel community, is it somebody in the intel community? And is there a sort of a coordination mechanism for these issues, or is that part of what the need for this cyber director or whatever the strategic leadership that y'all are talking about is?
I think that's exactly what we're talking about right now. A lot of those decisions are made mainly, and not to say it's to the exclusion of agencies like DHS and Commerce, et cetera, but mostly done at DoD. And there are, especially with cyber operations and effects, follow-on impacts to other areas of our infrastructure and the United States. And so I think that that's why we are arguing so vehemently for a national cyber director who would have visibility, or at least a seat at the table to have visibility into operations from Title 10 and Title 50. And so they wouldn't direct those operations by any means.
Right.
They would at least have a seat to be able to note an objection or point out that something else would be affected for the United States.
Right.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Brandon.
And I think the most troubling thing I learned when I'm on the commission is how much there's almost no coordination, right? There's a division between the DoD, Cyber Command, NSA in some ways. There's also division externally between the Department of Justice and Department of State. When we do these indictments, there's no collaboration there. We need someone in control of the situation. We need someone judging intel gain loss and the need for offensive exploit capabilities depending on the international environment. And there's no one doing that right now. And that's really troubling.
So I will say,
go ahead.
If I may, there is some, with the release of, well, let me just say that there are some mechanisms within the federal government that may or may not be public, that it require coordination between DoD for any cyber operations, right, with other agencies. So it's not to say nothing exists. It's just that oftentimes it's perhaps not as thorough and not as collaborative as we think is necessary.
No, but I mean, back when we started sort of early offensive cyber stuff, there were these interagency groups, and you'd come together, everyone would sort of say yes or no, but you knew there were other conversations taking place right outside the room, and so we can't get into the details of it, obviously, but you're absolutely right. It's an interesting and a challenging situation. One of the attendees asked, and there's actually a couple of questions on this sort of area. So, Ali, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. So, one, is extending the commission the right move? There wasn't a lot of, according to this questioner, since there wasn't a lot of private leadership on the commission, should there be more requirements for procedural openness, more private sector involvement? And then second, you guys mentioned Dwight Weingarten asked, what are the topics of the other remaining white papers, if you can tell us that?
Yeah, sure. So to start with the first part of the question is that, so it was important that we were able to have the commission established in the first place. It was long overdue. The status quo is not acceptable and it's trending in the wrong direction. And so this is the beginning of a process moving forward that hopefully will get the endorsement of the Congress and the same participation from the executive branch. But to the point of the question, if private sectors play such a large role in this, I do think that moving ahead, that's something that must be considered. Tom Fanning was the champion for us on the commission, and we were so lucky to have him because he had so many good connections, and he's been, pounding this drum of cybersecurity, and we need to invest and we need to collectively work together for quite a long time. Also, Representative Patrick Murphy, former Representative Patrick Murphy, also works within the space as well. So we were able to leverage a lot of his experience, current business experience, to be able to have that bigger impression of the key players in the industry as well within the private sector, the critical infrastructure private sector folks. So telecom, water, financial folks, everybody that is getting attacked regularly. And it's really up to them at this point to kind of figure out how tall do I want to build my fence, but that's just not going to stop everything. And so moving ahead, I do think that we have to see how successful we were. So that's going to take time for us to be able to go back and really see how things, whether they're passed into law or they become policy recommendations internal to certain departments and agencies, that needs to settle first before we look to kind of retackle this problem. So I do hope that the success of the commission having the 4 sitting legislators, so you do have a center of gravity and you have that ability to move things forward by also having executive branch and private industry provide critical information. This is like the right model. Like this is how Congress, the executive branch, and public sectors should work together collectively, collaboratively. And I think that this is a good model for other commissions as well as they look to move forward to have these critical elements in play with that commitment to actually trying to do something for national defense. So we'll see. Also to the point of like the additional papers, I know Brandon had mentioned his, but also we are drafting one right now to talk about National Cyber Director. Of course, we can't let that go. And then also we're looking at workforce, which is an incredibly important issue that we did not have an opportunity to go into detail here, but I do hope that there is opportunity in the future because while you can focus on ones and zeros, you really need to make the commitment to having the people in place and developing them over time. That's critical.
Absolutely.
Something that's overlooked. And then also, of course, very important, supply chain. We need to have some conversations about supply chain security and also figuring out what needs to happen next with respect to a national strategy.
Well, great. Key issues. Thank you so much, Allie. Thank you to the whole panel. I should mention Brandon, of course, was a senior advisor, and he currently serves at Marine Corps University. Some great experience there. And John, obviously, his prior service at DHS and various other jobs, including on the Hill. Really great experience from the whole team here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. A reminder on July 23rd, Thursday at 5 p.m., we'll have the director of the Defense Innovation Unit on our NatSec Nightcap series. So more to discuss on cyber. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, the audience, and everybody have a great afternoon.